By the end of the Second World War, the American tank industry found itself in a rather peculiar position. On one hand, the United States had achieved impressive success. At the beginning of the war, the country possessed only a few hundred light tanks and merely a few dozen medium ones. But the Americans quickly caught up, and in some respects even slightly surpassed, the leading tank-producing nations of the world. When the medium tank Sherman was created, it was among the best medium tanks in existence. The United States also achieved remarkable results in the production of self-propelled artillery. However, by the end of the war, the American tank industry faced a major question mark. Not only had they failed to overtake the Germans, but a deep crisis had also begun to form. This crisis might not have seemed apparent from the perspective of the spring of 1945, yet upon closer examination, it becomes clear that the situation in American tank building was far from ideal. It would be wrong to say that everything was bad in the American tank industry. Overall, the Americans ranked third in global tank production, and in some areas even took the lead. Therefore, before turning to the problems, it is worth discussing the achievements, and at the same time, the roots of the difficulties that followed. By 1943, the state of the American tank industry was, if not ideal, at least no worse than that of Germany. By the autumn of 1942, the medium tank Sherman, the second most mass-produced tank of the Second World War, made its combat debut. This vehicle was a logical development of a pre-war platform that the Americans wisely decided not to replace, thereby avoiding a drop in production output. Overall, American tank manufacturers demonstrated impressive flexibility and the ability to adapt rapidly to production challenges. At the beginning of the war, the Americans primarily relied on radial air-cooled aircraft engines, but by 1943 they had adopted an entire range of engines. In the Soviet Union, the engine problem was solved by constructing several plants to produce the V2 family of engines. In the United States, however, 4 different types of engines were manufactured for the same family of medium tanks. And there was even a 5th type used on one modification, though that version was soon discontinued. Naturally, this required variations in hull designs, but thanks to 4 major engine producers, Continental, Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors, the United States managed to eliminate the shortage of engines entirely. Another important point is that 49,000 medium Sherman tanks with diesel engines were produced in just 3.5 years, while 61,000 Soviet T-34s and T-34-85s were produced from the summer of 1940 to 1946. The T-34 family was built at 6 factories in total, or 7 if we include the evacuation of one plant from Kharkiv to Nizhny Tagil, whereas the Sherman family of medium tanks was manufactured at 10 different plants. Moreover, American factories supplied tanks not only to their own army, but also to the British, who received more than 17,000 tanks, roughly 1/3 of the total production. In reality, the medium tank M4 stands as the main achievement of American tank industry. It was a true workhorse of the United States Army, possessing from the very beginning an impressive potential for improvement. The Americans managed, without particular difficulty, to mount a new turret on the M4 chassis, resulting in a tank that was not inferior to the Soviet T-34-85, and most importantly surpassed the German tank of the 4th model, which was its main opponent between 1943 and 1945. A crucial advantage was that the running gear could also be modernized, which improved performance in the control compartment, and the introduction of a new suspension largely solved the problem of excessive ground pressure. After the war, it turned out that the chassis of the medium tank M4 with the new suspension was capable of carrying even a 4.1-inch gun, made possible thanks to the record turret diameter for its class, about 5 feet 9 inches. For comparison, the German tank of the 4th model had already exhausted its modernization potential by the end of 1942. No less important was that the modernized M4 medium tank chassis proved suitable for a new generation of self-propelled artillery mounts, some of which entered serial production by the end of the war. Even greater success was achieved by the American tank industry in developing light tanks and light self-propelled guns. In many ways, this was due to the fact that within the armament system, these vehicles occupied not the niche of a cheaper and lighter alternative to medium tanks, but were used as reconnaissance and auxiliary tanks. After the story of the medium tank M7, where the desire for thicker armor resulted in a vehicle with the weight of a medium-class machine, development took a different path. The light tank M24 became not only the best light tank of the second half of the war, but also a successful platform for self-propelled artillery. Some of these self-propelled vehicles even entered serial production, though too late for the Second World War, but just in time for the Korean War, where their use produced positive results. Moreover, it was precisely the use of light chassis as the basis for self-propelled guns that later became a priority direction for American tank development. The program for creating medium tank destroyers also proved successful. It should be noted that the command of the tank destroyer forces initially considered the self-propelled M18 to be more promising, but in practice, the opposite turned out to be true. First, the armor protection of these vehicles was insufficient even against heavy machine gun fire. Second, it was impossible to mount anything larger than a 3-inch gun on such a chassis. Experiments were conducted, but the results were negative. However, the creation of a medium self-propelled mount with a new gun led to the appearance of the M36, the most successful American tank destroyer. The vehicle was not built from scratch. Previous self-propelled mounts were converted, and the chassis of the medium tank M4A3 was also used. Such optimization made it possible, in the shortest time, to equip the troops with M36 vehicles, which were used even as full-fledged tanks. Finally, the Americans turned out to be the only ones among the allies of the anti-Hitler coalition who managed not only to create a new generation medium tank, but also to use it in combat. This was, of course, the heavy tank T-26E3, also known as the M26 heavy tank. It was created with enormous difficulty, yet it is worth recalling that the Soviet T-44 also appeared through much hardship and never reached the front, and the British Centurion arrived too late for the war. The T-26E3 was not without problems, but it performed successfully during the final year of the war, and continued to serve for quite a long time afterward. Durability, it must be said, became almost a rule for American tanks and self-propelled guns produced in the second half of the war. Most of them were retired only in the 1950s, and in other countries they were often operated much longer. The light tank M24 and the medium tank M4 have in fact only recently been fully retired. 1943 was mentioned for a reason. That year, the United States faced its most serious setbacks of the entire war period, and in several directions at once. First, the heavy tank development program reached a dead end. The heavy tank of the 6th model was deemed obsolete and no longer met modern requirements, so mass production never began. Second, the advanced light tank program, as mentioned earlier, ended up producing a medium tank instead. As a result, the new generation light tank appeared a year later. However, this did not cause major concern, since light tanks were performing secondary tasks. The real problem was the failure of the new generation medium tank. The overall concept of the 20th model medium tank was quite good, and the machine looked modern at the time of its debut. Yet compared to the German Panther, this medium tank lost in every respect. Incidentally, the Soviet tank of the 43rd model turned out no better. The main issue with the 20th model medium tank and other machines in its family was reliability. Various technical problems appeared with unpleasant regularity. Each vehicle had its own flaws: an unreliable transmission, an overloaded suspension system, or an overly complex electromechanical transmission. The result was an unsuccessful start represented by the 23rd model medium tank, which even entered serial production but proved completely unsuitable for frontline service. American designers also faced enormous difficulties with torsion bar suspension. By the end of 1942, after studying the Soviet KV-1 and the German 3rd model tank, it became clear that torsion suspension was the optimal choice. Yet while it was implemented rather quickly on light tanks, on medium tanks it became a constant source of headaches. The same applied to the 25th model medium tank with an improved engine, which was also armed with a 90mm gun, approximately 3.5 inches. Surprisingly, the 26th model heavy tank with an improved engine turned out to be a success. Due to its reinforced armor protection and increased weight, it immediately received an upgraded suspension system. But now the tank was officially considered a heavy one. This was not only because its weight had increased from 30 tons, about 66,000 pounds, on the 20th model medium tank, to 40 tons, about 88,000 pounds, but also because the reinforced frontal armor was designed to match that of the German Tiger. According to the test results, the 26th model heavy tank with an improved engine became the winner in the race for a new medium tank, but several nuances remained. The vehicle was the most reliable among the competitors, but it still fell short of the 4th model medium tank standards. The Ordnance Department clearly knew something about this, since Operation Zebra, the mission during which the tank made its combat debut, included significant technical support. The real situation with the tank's reliability became evident only during the battles in Korea, where roughly 60% of the losses were due to various mechanical failures. Moreover, American tank crews considered the best vehicle in Korea not the 26th model medium tank with an improved engine, nor its successor the Patton, but rather the 4th model medium tank with an upgraded suspension, simply because it was far more reliable. Of course, the conditions in Korea were completely different, yet this is a remarkably telling fact. Still, other problems of a somewhat different nature also emerged. As mentioned earlier, when the American heavy tank was developed, its frontal protection was modeled after the German Tiger. However, in reality, the combat protection provided by its 4-inch hull armor and 4.5-inch turret armor proved insufficient. The very first battle ended with the American tank being penetrated by Tiger shells, and the Tiger was far from the most dangerous opponent. The Pershing's classmate was the German medium tank Panther, which surpassed the American vehicle in armor protection. Only by the end of the war did the effective range of the American 90mm gun against the Panther reach about 1 kilometer, roughly 3,300 feet. Meanwhile, the Panther's gun could destroy the American tank from a greater distance. In essence, the protection of the officially designated heavy tank was only sufficient against armor-piercing shells from the German 75mm gun, and even then, not at all ranges. Thus, the American tank never caught up to the Panther. Moreover, the reserves for increasing armor protection had already been exhausted. The next tank, the Patton, was an improved Pershing. In fact, part of those vehicles were modernized older tanks. Thanks to a more powerful engine, its mobility improved, but many of the drawbacks of the previous model remained. As a result, the Patton did not perform particularly well in the Korean War. Its reliability was far from ideal. According to the plans, 6,000 such tanks were to be produced, but this required reaching a target capacity of 600 tanks per month. Although one plant managed to reach this figure, the Detroit tank arsenal delivered slightly more than 150 vehicles even in its peak months. Even if production had continued after the war, the target of 6,000 would still have remained unreachable. Thus, the previous model, the Sherman, remained the main American medium tank. A similar situation occurred in the Soviet Union, where the T-44 did not replace the T-34-85, and the T-54 required 5 years of refinement. Only in the 1950s did the T-34-85 cease to be the main tank of the Soviet Army. The greatest problem was that the American heavy tank was the best vehicle the United States Army had in service. Therefore, when the German heavy tank Königsteiger unexpectedly appeared in the summer of 1944, a flurry of American heavy tank projects emerged almost overnight, all based on the existing machine. Initially, there was an idea to breathe new life into the old heavy tank, but by the end of summer 1944, that project had turned into little more than a test platform. Meanwhile, the Ordnance Department continued efforts to produce something decent from another heavy tank project. However, that one also became more of a quick fix. In February 1945, the vehicle was reclassified as a self-propelled gun since it lacked a turret. The result was the heaviest, most protected, and at the same time the slowest American combat vehicle of the Second World War. And also the most absurd one. Judging by all indications, it was built mostly out of principle. By the spring of 1945, in addition to the models already mentioned, 6 more heavy tanks were under development, some being direct upgrades of the base model. Apparently, the Ordnance Department had set off a kind of race, hoping that at least one tank would reach the battlefield in time. That expectation was partly fulfilled. In March 1945, one of the heavy tank variants with a more powerful gun appeared at the front. It was heavy only in terms of armament, although in the 3rd Armored Division it received additional side skirts. The vehicle saw some combat and even managed to destroy several targets. A series was planned. Initially, 1,000 such tanks were to be produced, but by summer, the number was reduced to 25. Another upgrade followed, a different heavy tank that differed not by its gun, but by its armor protection. This machine barely missed the war but never became mass-produced either. It was quickly discovered that the price for thick armor was not only reduced mobility, but also decreased reliability. There was also a third option for improving the Pershing, which aimed to combine a more powerful gun with thicker armor. This was the heavy tank known as the Heavy Tank T-32. The idea itself was not bad, but its authors forgot one simple thing. Instead of a simple improvement of the T-26E3, they ended up with an entirely new tank. And that, above all, meant increased production time. As a result, instead of producing additional M4A3E2 tanks that the troops had requested, they first built a tank that appeared a few months after the fighting had already ended, and then another one, the first prototype of which was delivered in January 1946. By then, the Army needed this machine about as much as a fish needs an umbrella. The armor protection was indeed strengthened, so much so that the German 88mm anti-tank gun could not penetrate it from the front. However, the gun of the heavy tank T-32 could not penetrate the frontal armor of the German heavy tank Tiger II. Moreover, the tank's trials turned into pure torment. The running gear had been significantly redesigned and the new components proved extremely unreliable. Still, the story of the heavy tank T-32 does not look as tragicomic compared to the great trio, the heavy tanks T-29, T-30, and T-34. Work on these machines began back in August 1944. At first, the focus was on the heavy tank T-29, armed with the same 105mm gun that was mounted on the heavy tank T-28 and the heavy tank M6A2E1. But almost immediately, an alternative project appeared, a tank with a 155mm gun. As for the heavy tank T-34, work on it began in January 1945. Compared to the T-29 and T-30, it was fitted with a 120mm gun that had the ballistics of an anti-aircraft weapon. In all other aspects, the machines were identical. The designers of these tanks did not make their task more difficult. They simply based them on the heavy tank T-26E3, including the frontal armor plate 4 inches thick, or 102mm. The result was an odd hybrid with a turret front more than 11 inches thick, about 280mm, and a hull front that could only be penetrated by German 75mm guns of medium power. Frankly speaking, such an approach raises some eyebrows. However, the weak frontal hull armor of the T-29, T-30, and T-34 family was only one of the problems. The military was eagerly awaiting these machines. On March 1, 1945, the Ordnance Committee authorized the production of 1,200 heavy tanks T-29, which clearly shows how much the U.S. Army needed heavy tanks. In reality, during 1945, only 2 turrets were made, the same ones that had been installed on the heavy tank M6A2E1. In fact, that was the original turret design for this machine, and the results of its trials were far from encouraging. Time passed, and by August 23, 1945, the Ordnance Committee drastically changed its production plans for the T-29. Out of the initially planned 1,152 units, the Press Steel Car Company produced only 2 tanks, one fully assembled and one partially completed. Further production work was transferred to the Detroit Arsenal, along with all materials related to the heavy tank. In total, 8 such tanks were built there. By early 1946, it was already clear that this tank was good only for experimental purposes. Moreover, the first of these tanks were actually delivered only in 1947, and their trials turned into a constant battle with the engine and transmission system. One of the main problems encountered by testers of the Big Three was that these tanks simply did not have a reliable powertrain. In an urgent effort, they created a power pack that included a 12-cylinder Ford GAC engine and the electromechanical transmission unit EIX 120, but as trials of the heavy tank T-32 showed, the EIX 120 proved to be extremely unreliable. As for the Ford GAC engine, which had an aviation origin, it worked satisfactorily in the T-32, which weighed approximately 119,000 pounds. But the almost 65-ton T-29 experienced constant breakdowns. In other words, even if the American tank industry had made an incredible leap and produced the heavy tank T-29 at the beginning of 1945, it certainly would not have reached the front. Following the trials of the heavy tank T-32, the Allison Company urgently developed a hydromechanical transmission, but its refinement took as long as 2 years. Regarding the engine, in 1948, the Continental AV-1791 won out among three types of power plants. And of the three guns considered, they chose the T-53, a system of approximately 4.7 inches caliber. This decision also came several years after the tank program had effectively been abandoned. It is hard to call the American New Generation Heavy Tank Development Program anything but an epic failure. Against this backdrop, the troubles of the Soviet tank industry look like mere trifles. From all these events, one can draw very discouraging conclusions. If the main problems in the Soviet tank industry turned out to be connected to excessive demands from the command, the Americans experienced an outright collapse. In essence, heavy tank development ended in nothing, and the development of medium tanks in the second half of the 1940s was reduced to a modest modernization of a vehicle that had been adopted in 1944. The drama described with tanks is only one facet of the overall picture that formed around the American tank program through the end of the Second World War. The development of new tanks did not mean that there were no other programs aimed at a more distant future. And here it becomes clear that military establishments in different countries often had very similar views on the same processes. This is well illustrated by the studies conducted under the patronage of the Army Ground Forces, the department known for having its own perspective on certain aspects of armaments and military equipment. For example, the significant delay in the release of the self-propelled M36 was directly related to the activities of this department. For this reason, the best of the American tank destroyers appeared on the battlefield not in June 1944, but in October 1944. On January 2, 1945, the Army Ground Forces initiated research work on the prospects for the development of armored vehicles. They were headed by Lieutenant Colonel Frederick S. Breckett of the Armored Forces Medical Research Laboratory at Fort Knox, Kentucky. It is itself interesting that such work was entrusted to a man who did not deal with tanks directly. Nevertheless, the report prepared by June 2, 1945, proved to be extremely interesting. Essentially, Breckett was loaded with data on the state of the armored vehicle industry, the latest developments, and information about enemy armored vehicles. The result issued somewhat resembled German developments. The conclusion stated that the American Army needed tanks with combat weights of 25, 45, 75, and 150 short tons. These corresponded to light tanks weighing about 50,000 pounds, medium tanks weighing about 90,000 pounds, heavy tanks weighing about 150,000 pounds, and super heavy tanks weighing about 300,000 pounds. It looked very similar to the well-known German E-series, only without the tank destroyer E-10, and with a light tank instead of the medium tank destroyer E-25. Equally interesting was that Breckett planned to arm such tanks with relatively small caliber guns having high penetration performance, again similar to the Germans. The proposals by Breckett were never realized in metal. Nevertheless, this activity clearly reflected the uncertainty of the American tank program. It must be said that the development of the new generation of self-propelled artillery vehicles did not go well. And while the issues with vehicles based on the light tank M24 were due to the end of hostilities, the self-propelled guns built on the chassis of the heavy tank T-26E3 simply failed. The situation was even more dire in the tank destroyer segment. No tank destroyers were developed on the basis of the heavy tank T-26E3, and overall, tanks and tank destroyers had become nearly identical in terms of armament. In this respect, the Americans were not alone. Similar situations had emerged in other countries as well. A special commission of the War Department was tasked with sorting out this mess, established on November 1, 1945. This body went down in history as the Stilwell Board since it was led by General Joseph Stilwell. The general was nicknamed Vinegar Joe for his difficult character and rather controversial reputation. However, the ideas proposed by his team turned out to be intelligent and practical. On January 16, 1946, the Stilwell Board prepared a list of the most important directions that were to determine the development of American tank building for the next 5 years after the war. First of all, the plans excluded super heavy tanks and tank destroyers, as well as anti-tank artillery. The reasons for eliminating the super heavy tanks were obvious. They had proven impractical. As for the tank destroyers, the commission reached a simple conclusion. The best tank destroyer is the tank itself. At that moment, this was indeed true. The Stilwell Board also recommended beginning the development of specialized tank engines, a task successfully implemented by the Continental Company. Work began on a new generation of light tanks. This was the start of the light tank T-37 project, as well as self-propelled artillery units based on it, which later became the 155mm howitzer SPG M44 and the 105mm howitzer SPG M52. Although the Stilwell board in its original form did not last long, General Stilwell died on October 12, 1946. It had a tremendous impact on the further development of American tank construction. The second half of the 1940s had to be devoted to work on new components, primarily tank engines and new weapons. The 90mm gun M3 and its variants remained the main armament of American medium tanks for a long time. Yet without this preparatory period, the qualitative breakthrough that American tank building achieved in the first half of the 1950s would not have been possible. To a large extent, that breakthrough was spurred by the war on the Korean Peninsula, which began in 1950.